The following program is a UWTV classic.
How do our genes influence our relationships? Find out next on Upon Reflection.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Ross Reynolds. Have you ever looked at someone of another gender and wondered whether she or he was a member of another species? Our guests today examine how genes and gender influence our relationships. Dr. David Barash has a doctorate in zoology and is a professor at the psychology department of the University of Washington. His wife, Judith Lipton, practices psychiatry. They collaborated on the book Making Sense of Sex. Thanks so much for being with us today on Upon Reflection.
Thank you, Rod.
This book appears to me to take a look at another side of the equation about relationships between the sexes. We've heard so much in recent years and recent decades, actually, about the nurture side of the equation, about how society has influenced the way that we are men and we are women and how we relate to one another. Your book takes a look at the nature side, at the biology of this. Was that your intent in this book?
Yes, very much. I think it's really a change of perspective that's long overdue. And it really is at the cutting edge of what scientists are now looking at and trying to understand about males and females in particular, and why it is that they're different, how it is that they're different, why it is that they're different, and trying to make sense of this from an underlying biological perspective. We've heard so much for so long, particularly from the traditional social sciences, psychology in fact, anthropology and sociology, that male-female differences are all what they call socially constructed. And there seems no doubt that there is a large component of that. But in the process, I think all of these specialists have really given insufficient attention to what it is that underlies being a male and being a female, frankly, in all living things, not just in humans. And now that we're starting to understand that, there's the discipline called evolutionary psychology. Before that, it was known as sociobiology, but basically it's the same thing. It's a different way of looking at it and gives all sorts of exciting new insights.
Well, you certainly don't say in this book that it all has to do with biology. You say that there is a balance between both biology and also society and the way that we're raised that influences our relationships. But when you looked at all the different topics that you dealt with in this book, what was the one that kind of jumped out at you as saying, biology is a big factor here and people don't really realize that? Is there one in particular or a couple?
Well, I think it starts with sex. I think when you really look at sexual behavior, all the way from sexual development at puberty to courtship in early adulthood, mating, marriage, problems that marriages have, sexual relationships within marriages, raising of children, really the biology of sex itself and the sexual part of it is what was most salient to me. Let me try to clarify. In medicine, I'm going to say this.
Well, let me ask you a question about sex, since you brought it up.
Okay.
Let's go right to that. I've talked to many women who say all men are sluts, because men have a tendency to seek out other relationships. Right. They tend to be less loyal in relationships, less monogamous in relationships. They tend to seek out more variety in relationships that women do. Is that just a cliche in society, or is that a reality, first of all? And second of all, is there a biological basis for that?
I don't like the put down the slut sort of negative connotation. I think that men...
It's usually said with a smile, but...
I think part of our book is really trying to be a compassionate understanding, though, and that's important, that men are more promiscuous by nature. They are more interested in sexual variety. They're more triggered, more easily triggered by verbal stimulus, by looking at pretty young girls or partially clad women or whatever. Men have a harder time with monogamy. They have a harder time with long commitment. The rates of adultery in males are higher. All those things are true. But that is not to stereotype men as bad in any way. It's just how they are as males, which tends to be more opportunistic sexual exploiters, if you will. Women by nature are more careful comparison shoppers, and that's not to say they're good either. Our book is not about values and what we think ought to be. It's really a description of what we think is. And we leave it to the future generations to scratch their heads and look at the data that we present and say, well, then what do we want for ourselves in this world? But by nature, males are more aggressive. They're more interested in sex for sex's sake, less interested in talk, less interested in romance. Those generalizations are true.
Is that generally true of the male of the species, David?
Yes, it is. It's true of males of other species, too. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's one of the things we found most striking, is that this is not simply a pattern one finds in human beings. And by the way, I should add, it's a pattern you find in humans not only in the United States, but you find it in South America and in England and in Europe, in Africa and Asia. This is a cross-species characteristics across the human species. But it's also true, as you asked in your question, across other species. Now, there are some interesting exceptions. There are some species in which the females are relatively aggressive, in which the males are more sexually retiring. But that's quite unusual. By and large, you find that male animals are the aggressive sexual advertisers. Females are, as Judy just said, this coy comparison shoppers. And beyond that, if we look at what it is to be male and what it is to be female, we can, from a really sort of a dispassionate biological perspective, sort of crawl out of our species skins and look at the world as though we were, say, Martian zoologists. We see some general patterns and some really rather powerful explanations for why.
Why?
Well, okay. What it comes down to is, what does it mean to be male and what does it mean to be female? And what this means has nothing to do with beards or penises or breasts or vaginas or any of the external stuff that most people think of when they think of males or females. What it really comes down to is, what kind of sex cells do they make? That is to say, do they make sperm or do they make eggs? If they make sperm, which are these very little sex cells, which males by definition then can make in very large numbers, then we call them males. If they make eggs, we call them females. But the consequence of that is really very far-reaching, because for instance, if you make sperm, that means that, say in the case of a human male, you produce maybe approximately 200 million sperm in a single ejaculation. Well, by definition, you're not going to be able to care very much about any one of them. If you're a female, you make a single egg about every 28 days. If that egg gets fertilized, then you make a placenta, you nourish that offspring, and then things are just starting, in fact, because then you have lactation for potentially a longer period yet. What is the consequence then of making a mistake if you're a female? It's enormous. What's the consequence of making a mistake if you're a male? It's pretty trivial. And so what you have then is an optimum strategy for females, which says, don't make mistakes. Be careful. What you've got is valuable here. It's an egg, it's a placenta, it's lactation.
So have fewer sexual relationships?
Possibly have fewer, but certainly be fussier about them. It won't take much to get your eggs fertilized, but once they're fertilized, you're stuck with the outcome. Whereas from the male perspective, the amount of energy that a male invests in a single ejaculation is equivalent of, I understand, a couple of potato chips. Well, that's pretty easily replaced. So what you're going to do if you're a male, and if you're simply concerned, now we're not talking about ethics here, we're talking about biology, pure biology across the animal world, is you try to provide yourself, your genes, with as many opportunities as possible. And it's almost, who cares what the consequences, because the consequences for you are very small. Whereas if you were a female, you would view that pattern, that interaction, very differently. And these are among the things that Judy's been finding in her practice, where people can, in fact, they may be a little bit insulted sometimes by being compared to animals in some ways. But let's face it, the reality is we are animals. We're not just animals, but we're animals too. And by looking at that animal part of us, we can get some insights and understand our inclinations that we didn't have before.
Well, what about the monogamy issue, or as the popular song had it, monogamy? Monogamy is somewhat unique to human beings?
No. There are some animals that are monogamous. There are a variety of birds, ducks and geese, and then a list of about 20-odd other mammals, which David can recite.
But I might add, that's 20 out of about 4,000. So it's not the run-of-the-mill pattern in mammals.
It's not the run-of-the-mill pattern, and it's not really what we see in human societies. Even in the United States, while our society may profess a desire for monogamy, what we really see is sequential monogamy at best, people going from monogamous relationships to other monogamous relationships, with a lot of adultery and promiscuity thrown in on the side. Monogamy is a difficult to achieve and fairly rare occurrence, even in the United States today, with its sociocultural values.
Now you deal with many couples where I'm sure monogamy is an issue. Are you able to tell them anything about the biological nature of monogamy to help them through things? Could you give an example, perhaps?
Well, one of the things that surprised me when I became a psychiatrist was that the most common suburban emergency is an adultery crisis. The main reason I would get called at midnight is someone finding someone else's underwear in their bedroom, in their drawer, or their spouse in bed with someone else. It's the cause of most emergency weekend calls and family crises. What I talk to people about is that fidelity is very difficult. You have to commit over the long haul. Everyone is prone to desire. Males are prone to desire by nature of their biology. They're prone to be interested in other mateships simply for the sexual opportunity, if you will, recreational sex. And they may be interested in recreational sex or sexual opportunity, but that's not to say they can or should give in to those interests. Having those interests, though, noticing how a pretty girl looks walking down the street or something, is a normal male thing. And I talk with males about how hard it is to restrain and deal with their own impulses. Females are more inclined to be adulterous when they're unhappy with their current relationship and essentially shopping elsewhere. And I try to talk with females about making their choices clear and clean cut so that they don't kind of bounce from one relationship to another looking for Mr. Good Guy and often being disappointed in their quests. I think about it in another context, too. I counsel a lot of young adults, and there was a young woman who was just getting out of her home situation, just emancipating from her family. And she found that whenever she was going out with guys, they would always want to have sex. And sometimes she might do it, and sometimes not. When she did, the more she had sex, the more possessive they became, and the more they became wanting more and more ownership of her time and space. She found that it was very difficult for her to have recreational sex, if you will, because the guys kind of wanted to own her. And we were able to talk about that on the biological level, that the men wanted what she had as a woman. And she needed to learn to be a more careful comparison shopper, if you will. Recreational sex for her was ill-advised because of the social consequences of what that would mean for her.
Well, beyond the social consequences and the spreading of your genes and the conservation of your eggs, I believe humans are somewhat unique among species in that having sex is also a lot of fun. I mean, it's pleasurable. Is that generally true among other species, that they have sex because it's fun?
That's a hard question, a remarkably hard question to answer, because of course we can never get outside of our own heads. We even have a hard time knowing to what extent sex is fun for other people, although we can intuit that it is, since it's fun for ourselves. When it comes to animals, all we can really say is that they do it. And presumably they get some gratification from it. If you watch sexual behavior among animals, aside from the remarkable degree of courtship and the strutting and the preening and the noise-making, by the way, almost all of which is done by males in an effort to attract females, again for the reasons I think we talked about, one gets the impression that it's a pretty automatic thing, that it's kind of like scratching an itch. It's remarkably unerotic by human standards. And what's interesting here is that humans really do make use of sex in a way that, if not unique, is extraordinary. Which is to say,
in what way?
Well, we use it not only for reproduction, clearly, but we use it obviously for something beyond reproduction. And in fact, there are many cases where people will be more likely to engage in sex, and good sex, in proportion as they know they're not reproducing. We'll use sex for bonding in particular.
See, and I think that's kind of a female strategy. I think the evolution of the female orgasm, and in fact the evolution of the female clitoris, is partly an evolutionary a piece of evolutionary leverage that human females have developed with the males, that they can, they're wired by their biology to like sex even when they're not ovulating, and to be able to be pleasured in the process, not just inseminated. And that makes sex more fun for the male and the female, and makes the likelihood of long-term pair bonding increased. So for the female who wants, say, access to the male's resources for 18 to 25 years while she's raising the babies, it pays her to be able to reward the male for sticking around by having a lot of fun in bed.
And interestingly, of course, it rewards herself at the same time.
It rewards
which
herself
is
at the same
sort
time.
of a win-win proposition then.
And by sex being fun for sex's sake, it helps couples stay together to take care of human infants, which just take forever to raise, and lots of money and time.
You also take a look at why is it that men tend to be stimulated more visually, they tend to go to strip clubs, they tend to consume pornography in much larger numbers than women do. They tend to not do that quite so much. Why is that? Do you know?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to the difference between sperm and eggs.
Yeah.
If you're making cheap gametes, then it pays you to have a low threshold for stimulation. After all, if you make a mistake, so what? You've lost a couple potato chips. I mean, it doesn't cost very much. It's interesting. If you walk through the swamps in southeastern United States during mating season in the spring for bullfrogs, you may well wind up with a male bullfrog clasped to the toe of your boot. In fact, maybe one on each boot. And they're ready to squirt out their sperm, and they may do that, and it doesn't cost them very much. Females aren't going to be doing that. Females have this precious load of eggs, and they're going to be very careful about to whom do they bequeath those eggs. And humans, again, we're not bullfrogs, but there's a bullfrog part of us which says, why should I be fussy? It doesn't cost me very much if I make a mistake, and if I'm successful, I'll inseminate some more eggs, and my genes will get that much more of a free ride.
One of the fascinating parts of this book, Making Sense of Sex, is where you take a look at the body images that tend to attract males to females and vice versa. Men tend to be attracted to women with a classic hourglass figure. Women tend to be attracted to men who are taller. Is there a biological basis for that?
We think there is. The females are interested in men who have power, resources, and good genes. And so physical size is correlated in our societies with power. Taller men are more likely to be leaders of corporations or corporate leaders or whatever. And in the book I give some case histories of how that works for tall men, the expectations that are put on tall men compared to short men. So women are looking for men with power and resources, and height is an indicator of those status symbols. Males, by contrast, are looking for females who are not pregnant and haven't been impregnated by somebody else. They look for, therefore, the small waists as an indication that somebody isn't already pregnant and probably hasn't been pregnant in the past, because that woman might be more likely to bear his offspring and not already be pregnant with someone else's, which is a risk for the male. We spend a lot of time in our book talking about the conundrum called mommy's babies, daddy's maybes. In other words, one of the facts of biology is that no male really knows who his offspring are. Before at least the onset of DNA analysis, males are guessing about who are their babies, whereas females know their babies and have no doubt about it at all. So males are in constant danger of being cuckolded, and are biologically wired to be on the lookout for that. Part of the interest in the hourglass figure then is looking at young women who are more likely to be faithful and not pregnant already with someone else's genes. Males also are more interested in harem developing, and so they're not interested particularly in power or money, they're interested in looks, and so they can accumulate, at least in theory, large numbers of those females, and again, inseminate as many as they would want. We recount one king in Africa who had 3,000 offspring and wasn't the slightest bit tired.
It's good to be king.
It's good to be king.
If you're a male.
If you're a male.
If you're a male, you can take it. That's why, again, this notion is that when it comes to polygyny, that human beings do have a primitive penchant for polygyny, because we're perfectly good mammals, and most mammals are in fact polygynous. And so you have the pattern whereby males will strive in most societies to accumulate additional wives. And usually they'll be attracted by the younger ones, of course. And that's one of the general patterns. And not surprisingly, younger women are, of course, more fertile. You don't get a comparable preference on the part of women for younger men. Men make sperm throughout their life, and in fact, as they get older, to some extent, they get more powerful and more desirable.
Let me put you a little bit on the spot. You're a husband and wife team. You're writing a book, Making Sense of Sex. You're coming to all these determination about the biological basis. Did you come across a chapter in this book or a section in this book where you looked at one another and you went, uh-huh?
I don't think we came to a chapter where we didn't do that, as a matter of fact.
Was there anything in particular, though, that really jumped out at you, that really told you something about your own relationships that you maybe hadn't been clear about before?
It's hard to say. I'm not sure there was a single one. As I said, we saw ourselves
We make jokes.
in every page.
We do make jokes. For example, will I offer to trade David having sex for a latte? If he brings me a latte, will we have sex? We'll joke about trading sex for resources in ways that are maybe sound crude to other people. We've talked a lot with our children about mate selection and about, because we have daughters, we've talked to them about, in kind of ways that make our children laugh, about needing to guard their precious eggs and being on the lookout for guys who have good genes and good resources and so forth. So we've made a lot of jokes about the biology. But I think there are some personal stories in the book. The two personal stories are one about our own issues with step-parenting, which we found very, very difficult, and we think for biological reasons. Now we can understand it with 20/20 hindsight, but in our earlier life we were not very good step-parents, and now I think we can understand why. And we also talked about some of the problems of having a two-career marriage, where I was away from the home a lot with David raising our children, and that was very stressful for us. And again, as a perfectly good mammal, I can understand why leaving my babies with David, who was much more indifferent to them. He loved them, but he wasn't lactating. It wasn't, the role reversal was very painful. And we wrote about that, and we hope that helps other people understand some of their conflicts.
What issues come up when we talk about transsexuals or homosexuals when we're discussing these biological bases of the way that we act as men and women? David?
Well, that's a biggie. One of the great mysteries, in fact, in biology applied to sex has to do with homosexuality and transsexuality. And to be honest, we're not prepared at this point to say a whole lot meaningful about what makes for transsexuality or homosexuality. There's an awful lot that's up in the air dealing with genetics and hormones. But what we do find really quite striking is if you look at the behaviors of homosexuals, whether male homosexuals or female homosexuals, if anything, that really confirms the male-female differences that we've been talking about. That is to say, if you look at the patterns of sexual behavior, for instance, male homosexuals, if you look at the behavior of gay males, you find that what it is, if anything, is really an exaggerated pattern of male sexuality, with extraordinarily high numbers of partners. Even in this day of AIDS, there's a strong tendency in that direction. Whereas if you look at the patterns of sexual behavior among lesbians, for instance, it's much closer to monogamy. And once again, what you get is sort of an exaggerated pattern of female style among female couples and of male style among male couples, which doesn't say anything about why you get homosexuality of one sort or another. But what it does for us, I think, is, if anything, at least emphasize that we're really on the right track in terms of what male sexuality is about, whatever it is that causes it.
There are those who theorize that these identities, these male-female identities, are quite mutable, and no one is 100% male or 100% female, or very few are, but we're all somewhere in between. Do you agree with that? Does your study of biology and psychiatry bear that out?
I think there's a wide range of individual differences, and you certainly see women who are sexual advertisers and aggressive sexual consumers, and men who are very interested in communication and intimacy and self-awareness, and men with high verbal skills and women with great engineering and performance skills. I mean, there's tremendous individual variation. But when it comes to some of the basic issues of, say, spending time with small children, who likes to be hanging around with babies, by and large, it's females. Who likes to have sex very frequently when they're tired as sort of a tranquilizer to help them relax, it's males.
Or if you look at violence, or inclinations toward violence, there's really a dramatic difference. I would say that, as far as I'm concerned, the dichotomy between male and female is one of the clearest ones that we find in the natural world. I mean, there are variations and gradations, but the truth is, it's like, just as there is day and night, there's a little bit of dawn and dusk in between, and there are in-betweens in humans too. But I think you'd have to be pretty blind to deny the fact that males and females are one of those basic ways in which the natural world is cleaved in two.
A lot of the things we've been talking about, I'm sure viewers find very controversial. And in fact, at the conclusion of your book, you express some concern that your findings and what you're writing about the biological basis of relationships between the sexes could be misused. Could you talk about why you wrote that and what concerns you have in that regard?
Well, our point in writing the book was that our belief that knowledge is power. We really love biology and we love the natural world. And by describing it, we hope to give our audience, give people a sense of curiosity and an invitation to know themselves in a Socratic sense. Where it can be misused is that if people make generalizations, for example, men like pornography, therefore pornography is good or pornography is bad. Generalizations of is equivalent to ought. We write a lot about that just because smallpox is natural doesn't mean that vaccine isn't indicated. Just with male violence is natural doesn't mean that we need to do something about it. Or adultery is natural, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing at all. That's our major concern, that we not be taken as apologists for natural order, which in many senses is not what we think might be good, but rather just what is.
I wonder if we need to use the word sexism, which is the critical term. And if sexism means simply identifying male-female differences, whether it's in anatomy or physiology or behavior, then we're sexist. But if it means valuing the two sexes differently, then that's something we're concerned about.
The book is Making Sense of Sex. David Barash, Judith Lipton, thank you very much for being on Upon Reflection.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.